I'd like to tell about another side of him. You know, much of his writing is rooted in what he called spirituality, which is, I guess, the best English translation that we could come up with about this deeper dimension, this existential dimension beyond just the psychic and the biological. And Dr. Frankl had a deeply spiritual side, and it was both religious and not religious. He did not believe, of course, that religion had a place in psychiatry, that was up to the individual patient, and we neither use that as a solution nor criticize it, as Freud did, as just an underdeveloped sense of something. He respected it and believed that it could help those it could help, but it was not the psychiatrist's role or the psychologist's role to be able to impose that on people. And he really was insistent on the differentiation. And in his own life, as I said earlier, he was not particularly observant religious or Jew, but he was very spiritual in his beliefs beyond the dimension of man. He said, you either have faith or you don't. It's nothing you can prove. It's nothing you can query. And if you believe, you believe. And he believed. However, he had another dimension to the spirituality that I think very few people knew about. One day I was driving from Baltimore to Washington because he was giving a speech for approximately 3,000 people at the Washington Hebrew congregation, and he had called me to let me know he was coming in and asked if I could pick him up at the airport, those kinds of things, which I always did. And because there's always a lot of traffic and I live about an hour from Washington, I left very early and got there about 20 minutes early. And when I arrived, I went up to the hotel room, and when I knocked on the door, Ellie opens the door and she goes like this. I walk in very quietly, and in a cornered room facing east is Dr. Frankl with a set of tefillin on, and he's quietly, obviously, praying. I had never seen him do this before, and I'd spent a lot of time with him, many Saturdays, etc., which is a Jewish Sabbath. I'd never seen him do that kind of thing before. I knew he had strong Jewish identity and was very proud of his Judaism, but I'd never seen him do anything like that before. So I very quietly, as quiet as I can be, asked him about it on the way to the thing, and he told me a story. He said that at the end of the war, they were death marching the concentration camp inmates and condensing them into various camps, and then they would destroy the old camps so there's no evidence of war crimes. And in the last camp he was in, and I'm not sure at this time, I think it was Turkheim, I'm not sure, near Dachau, and they had marched him into the camp, but there were different inmates from various camps now. And one morning, he gets up and he looks over, and someone had smuggled in a set of tefillin, the Jewish prayer boxes that Orthodox Jews use when they do their morning and evening prayers during the week. And he saw this man get up and say the prayers and put on the tefillin, and when he was done, Dr. Frankl asked the man if he could borrow his tefillin to put them on. He just had an urge to do this, and he said, I hadn't put on tefillin since my bar mitzvah when I learned how to do it, but I just felt like I wanted to do it. And he asked the man, he had to kind of remind him how to put it on, and he put it on, and he said he was so weak he couldn't remember any Jewish prayers. So the only thing he could remember was the Kaddish, which is a prayer that affirms the importance of life at a time when people die. People commonly refer to it as a prayer for the dead, but it's really a very life-affirming prayer. And it's the only thing, but all Jews know this prayer. And it's the only thing he could remember by heart. So he got up, put on a tefillin that day, and said Kaddish. Well, if you talk about divine intervention, that afternoon the camp was liberated by American soldiers. And he told me that for the rest of his life, he got up every morning, put on tefillin, and said Kaddish. So that was the kind of spirituality beyond just religious or observant that he possessed. And I had never known that, and that was a very private part of his life. I'm almost afraid it's too private to tell. But it was such a fascinating part of him. And in fact, many years later when he was getting old, now you have to remember us getting old. I didn't meet him until he was over 70. He was about 71. I'm sorry, about 71 when I first met him. And I never thought, I used to say, gee, I wish I had met him when he was 50 because, you know, how old am I, how long will I get to know him? Of course, he lived to be 92 and it was wonderful. But many years later when he was getting older, we had a conversation one day. My family in Baltimore is in the funeral home business. We're the Jewish funeral director in Baltimore. And he was always fascinated by this because he always had two concerns about his death. One was that he couldn't be buried next to Ellie because in the cemeteries in Europe, you're buried in religious sections and you don't bury Catholics with Jews. In the United States, we have many non-sectarian cemeteries, and he found that very interesting. And in fact, my understanding was that at one time he even looked into whether there were any in Austria, and there weren't not any. And then he sort of came to this realization that it didn't matter whether he was buried next to her or not, she would always be in his heart. So that was interesting to him. But the other thing was that because his family, his daughter and his grandchildren are Catholic, it always bothered him that he didn't have a son who would say Kaddish for him, because it's a tradition in Jewish life for a child to say Kaddish on the anniversary of the parent's death. And it's a very important tradition. I always do it for my father and grandfather. And he was talking to me, and I said, well, I always do it for my father and my grandfather because it was important to them. My grandmother wasn't so important to, so I didn't do it. My mother, of course, is still living. So one day he said to me, would you say Kaddish for me after I die? Sorry. And I was so moved that he saw me as a son, or that close, that of course I agreed immediately. And to this day, I always go to synagogue on September 2nd, and I say Kaddish. And usually within a day or two, I call Ellie to tell her that I've done that. And I know he has one other person to do it for him also, Rabbi Bulk, I believe, in Canada, who is getting older now. And I just thought that was one of the most touching things, most important things he ever said to me, because it was really a true confirmation of what I always felt about him, but that I didn't dare think that he would feel about me.